On a quiet afternoon in Burbank, California, the studios of NBC were doing what they had done 1,000 times before, humming with routine. Cables were dragged across concrete floors. Camera operators adjusted lenses. Stagehands laughed too loudly. Music floated from rehearsal rooms, overlapping with voices and footsteps, creating that familiar controlled chaos that only television studios knew how to produce. This was not a day meant to be remembered. It was supposed to be just another rehearsal for the Dean Martin show, another polished broadcast, another smooth performance led by a man who made charm look effortless, another evening America would enjoy and forget by the next morning. But sometimes history hides in ordinary moments, and sometimes it arrives without sound. Dean Martin stood near center stage, jacket loosened, sleeves slightly rolled, holding a paper cup of water. He had just finished rehearsing a sketch. The laughter from the crew was still fading when he glanced toward the edge of the stage, not because someone called his name, but because something felt different. At the far end, under dimmer lights, a young man stood alone beside a grand piano. He wasn't speaking. He wasn't moving. He wasn't trying to be noticed. Yet somehow he was impossible to ignore. The young man's posture was calm but tense, like someone waiting for a verdict. His hands hovered close to his sides, fingers long and thin, twitching slightly as if they already knew where they wanted to be. His eyes weren't scanning the room. They weren't searching faces. They were focused inward, as if he were listening to something no one else could hear. Dean watched him for a long moment. Then he turned to the producer. "Who's that?" Charlie Morrison followed Dean's gaze. His expression tightened in a way that told Dean this was not a simple answer. That's the pianist," Charlie said carefully. Dean raised an eyebrow. "The guest." "Yes." Dean nodded slowly. "Why does he look like he's about to be executed?" Charlie exhaled. "Because we didn't tell you something." Charlie led Dean off to the side, lowering his voice, glancing around as if the walls themselves might overhear. "His name is Thomas Reed," Charlie said. 23, self-taught composer. He was approved months ago. "So what's the problem?" Charlie hesitated. "He's deaf." The word landed softly, too softly. Dean blinked once. "Deaf. Born that way, completely." There was no dramatic pause, no gasp, no immediate reaction. Dean simply looked back toward the piano. "He's going to play live," Charlie continued. "No click track, no orchestra, no audio reference. If he loses timing, if he drifts." Dean cut him off. "Can he play?" Charlie frowned. "That's not the point." "That is the point," Dean said. Charlie ran a hand through his hair. "We're broadcasting to millions. This isn't a charity hour, it's live television." Dean studied the young man again. Thomas Reed hadn't moved. "He hasn't even touched the keys yet," Dean said quietly. No one told Thomas Reed what was being said behind the scenes. He stood exactly where he was told to stand. He waited exactly as long as he was told to wait. He did not fidget. He did not pace. He did not ask questions. Because he had learned long ago that silence made people uncomfortable. And when people were uncomfortable, they often made decisions about you instead of with you. Thomas had never heard applause, never heard laughter, never heard the word music spoken aloud. But he had felt floors tremble beneath his feet when orchestras rehearsed. He had felt wooden stages vibrate when choirs sang. He had felt the deep, living pulse of sound through bone and skin and muscle. Music to him was not noise. It was pressure, movement, weight, emotion translated into physical form. His mother used to place his small hands against the piano when he was a child, letting him feel the resonance of the strings. His father would tap rhythms against the table, slow at first, then faster, teaching him timing not through sound but through pattern. Thomas learned music the way blind people learned color, not by seeing it, but by understanding how it made the world respond. Still standing there now, in that massive studio, he felt the familiar tension crawling up his spine. He knew this place wasn't built for people like him. Dean Martin walked toward the piano. He didn't announce himself, didn't wait for an introduction, didn't ask permission. When Thomas finally noticed movement in his peripheral vision, he startled slightly. then immediately stood, his face opening into a wide, hopeful smile. Dean extended his hand. "Hello, Thomas." The words hung in the air. Thomas shook Dean's hand warmly, nodding, smiling, responding to a greeting he never heard. Something inside Dean shifted. Not pity. Respect. Dean didn't repeat himself. He didn't look awkward. He simply gestured toward the piano and then toward Thomas, his expression asking a simple question. "Can you play?" Thomas nodded. He sat. The studio noise faded as his fingers touched the keys. Not dramatically. Not confidently. Just carefully. He pressed one note. Then another. Then he stopped. Closed his eyes. And then the room changed. The melody that followed wasn't loud. It wasn't fast. It wasn't designed to impress. It was intimate. Each note seemed placed, not played. The music rose slowly as if it were discovering itself in real time. It carried a sadness that wasn't heavy, a hope that wasn't loud. It felt personal, like reading a letter never meant to be shared. One by one, conversations stopped. Crew members froze mid-movement. A camera operator lowered his lens. Someone backstage forgot what they were doing. Dean didn't blink. He just listened. Not with his ears. With his chest. The music grew not in volume but in presence. The piano seemed to breathe beneath Thomas's hands. When the final note came, it wasn't slammed. It was released. Silence followed. A kind of silence no one rushed to fill. Then someone began to clap. Then another. Then the entire studio erupted. Thomas lifted his head, startled, seeing movement, emotion, hands clapping, but not hearing any of it. His eyes searched the room, uncertain. Dean stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. Thomas looked up. Dean smiled. He slowly formed the words with his hands. Amazing. Thomas's hands trembled as he replied in sign. Thank you. Dean shook his head gently. No, he signed back, imperfect but sincere. Thank you. Charlie watched from the sidelines, stunned not by the music but by something else. Dean Martin was signing. Badly, but intentionally. That night, long after rehearsal ended, Dean Martin went home and did something no one ever saw him do. He studied. He sat at his kitchen table with a book on basic sign language, turning pages slowly, memorizing shapes, practicing motions in the air. Not because he had to, because he wanted to. Because some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The first rule of live television was simple. Never introduce uncertainty. Everything had to be controlled, timing, sound, pacing, reactions. The audience at home was invisible but unforgiving. One mistake, one awkward pause, one moment that felt unscripted, and the illusion shattered. Dean Martin knew that rule better than anyone. Which is why 2 nights before the broadcast, he sat alone in his dressing room, staring at the show rundown, feeling something he had not felt in years. Doubt. Not doubt in Thomas Reed. Doubt in the system itself. The studio lights were off now, but Dean could still hear the echo of the piano in his head, not the notes, but the space between them. That quiet intensity. That strange gravity Thomas carried without realizing it. Dean leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Television had trained him to fill silence. Thomas had taught him that silence could speak. That scared people. Charlie Morrison knocked once, then entered without waiting for permission. We need to talk, Charlie said. Dean didn't look up. We already are. Charlie shut the door. I just got off the phone with standards. Dean sighed. Let me guess, they're nervous. They're more than nervous. They're asking questions we don't have answers to. Dean finally turned. Like. What if he freezes? What if the audience laughs? What if people think we're exploiting him? Dean's expression hardened. What if, Dean replied calmly, people finally see something real? Charlie rubbed his face. Dean, this isn't a nightclub. This is NBC, 20 million viewers, advertisers, affiliates. Dean stood. And Thomas Reed is a musician, he said, not a risk assessment. Charlie's voice dropped. If this goes wrong, it won't just be his night that's ruined. It'll be yours. Dean smiled faintly. I've had a good run. Across the city, in a quiet rented apartment, Thomas Reed sat on the edge of his bed, hands resting on his knees, staring at nothing. His sister was asleep in the next room. His parents whispered softly in the kitchen, trying not to let fear leak into their voices. Thomas wasn't afraid of the piano. He was afraid of people. He had learned early that audiences didn't always clap for the right reasons. Sometimes they clapped because they were impressed. Sometimes because they were uncomfortable. Sometimes because they didn't know what else to do. He pressed his fingertips together, feeling the slight tremor in his hands. He wondered if tomorrow would be another moment where he was seen but not understood. The phone rang. Thomas didn't hear it, but his mother did. She froze. The call was for Thomas. She handed him the receiver, watching his face closely. On the other end of the line, Dean Martin spoke slowly, carefully, choosing his words as if sound itself were fragile. Thomas, it's Dean. Thomas couldn't hear him, but he felt the vibration through the line. He watched his mother's expression change as she translated. Dean wasn't calling to cancel. He was calling to reassure. When Thomas finally hung up, he signed only one sentence. He believes in me. His mother covered her mouth. The morning of the broadcast arrived heavier than expected. NBC studios buzzed with an edge no one could quite explain. It wasn't panic, it was anticipation mixed with unease. Crew members whispered more than usual. Producers checked equipment twice. No one joked about the piano segment. Something about it felt different. Even the air felt quieter. Midday, a visitor arrived unannounced. He didn't come through the front gates. He didn't alert publicity. He simply walked in, wearing dark sunglasses and a familiar posture that caused heads to turn before minds caught up. Elvis Presley had not planned to come. He had heard about a deaf pianist, about Dean Martin risking his reputation, about a moment that wasn't supposed to exist. And Elvis, who understood performance better than most men alive, understood instinct when he felt it. He found Dean near the stage. They didn't embrace, they didn't joke. Elvis simply said, "Is it true?" Dean nodded. Elvis glanced toward the piano. "He's brave," Elvis said quietly. Dean shook his head. "No, he's honest." Elvis took off his sunglasses. "Then don't let them cut him short." Dean met his eyes. "I won't." 30 minutes before airtime, Thomas stood backstage, hands clasped, breathing slowly. He felt the vibrations of footsteps through the floor. He felt the hum of electricity in the walls. This place was alive. Dean approached him, placing himself squarely in Thomas's line of sight. He signed slowly, imperfectly, but clearly. "Remember, don't play for them. Play for yourself." Thomas swallowed and nodded. Dean hesitated, then added another sign he had practiced all night. "You belong here." Thomas's eyes filled instantly. The red light blinked on. The theme music played. Millions of homes across America tuned in. They expected jokes, songs, comfort. They did not expect to be changed. Dean moved through the opening segments effortlessly. His voice was smooth, his timing perfect. But beneath the surface, something inside him was coiled tight. Then the cue arrived. The piano was rolled into position. The studio grew restless. Dean stepped into the light. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, pausing longer than usual, "tonight we're going to do something a little different." That pause was not in the script. "Tonight," Dean continued, "we're not going to entertain you." The audience shifted. "We're going to listen." Silence. Real silence. Dean turned slightly toward the piano. "And I ask you, for just a few minutes, to let go of everything you think you know about music." Backstage, Charlie Morrison closed his eyes. Thomas walked onto the stage. He felt the warmth of the lights on his skin. He felt the weight of the moment press into his chest. He did not hear the audience. He did not hear the whispers. He felt only the piano waiting for him. Dean guided him gently, then stepped back. No orchestra. No introduction. Just a man, a piano, and a nation holding its breath. Thomas sat. He placed his hands on the keys. And for the first time in his life, he did not feel like an exception. He felt like a beginning. The studio did not feel like a studio anymore. It felt like a courtroom. Not because someone was on trial, but because a verdict was about to be delivered and no one knew what it would be. The cameras were rolling. The red light was on. The country was watching. And for the first time in live television history, no one was talking. Dean Martin stood slightly to the side of the piano, hands folded loosely in front of him, eyes fixed on Thomas Reed. His body was relaxed, but his mind was sharp, fully present, fully aware that what was about to happen could not be undone. This was not a segment anymore. This was a moment. Dean had broken another rule by not filling the space with words. He did not explain further. He did not soften expectations. He did not prepare the audience. He trusted them. And more importantly, he trusted Thomas. Thomas sat at the piano, the bench cool beneath him. The stage lights pressed against his skin like warm hands. He could feel the audience through the floor, through the faint vibration of hundreds of bodies shifting in their seats. He could not hear a single sound, but he could feel everything. The piano beneath his fingertips felt different tonight, alive, expectant. He rested his hands on the keys, not yet pressing them, letting the instrument's weight settle into him. He closed his eyes, not to block out the world, but to enter it. The first note came softly, so softly that even those watching at home leaned closer to their televisions. It was not perfect. It was human. The second note followed, then the third, each one placed with intention, as if Thomas were building a bridge plank by plank across a vast silence. The melody did not rush. It listened. In living rooms across America, something strange happened. People stopped chewing, stopped talking, stopped shifting in their chairs. Children quieted without being told. A woman in Ohio set down her laundry basket and forgot why she was holding it. A man in Texas turned up the volume, then realized volume no longer mattered. Because this music was not asking to be heard. It was asking to be felt. The piano grew stronger, not louder but deeper. Thomas's fingers moved with confidence now, guided not by sound but by memory, vibration, and emotion. His body leaned slightly into the instrument, absorbing the resonance through bone and muscle. Every chord traveled through the stage, through the floor, through the studio, through the nation. Dean Martin did not move. He had performed in front of kings, presidents, and packed arenas. But he had never witnessed this. This was not a performance. This was a conversation between silence and truth. Backstage, Charlie Morrison stood frozen, hands clenched at his sides. This wasn't going wrong. That terrified him more than if it had. Because nothing in his experience had prepared him for something going this right. The camera cut to a close-up of Thomas's face. His eyes were closed. Not tightly. Peacefully. His expression carried no strain, no fear, no self-consciousness. Only presence. The music swelled, not into chaos, but into clarity. The notes unfolded like memories, each one carrying weight, regret, hope, and release. It was as if the piano itself had decided to speak through him. Thomas had never heard applause. But at that moment, he felt something else. Connection. In the front row, a man removed his glasses to wipe his eyes. Behind him, a woman pressed her hand to her chest, as if steadying her heart. Somewhere in the darkness of the studio, Elvis Presley stood completely still, his head slightly bowed, lips parted, not in surprise but in recognition. He knew this feeling. It was the same feeling he had felt the first time music had taken him over, when control gave way to surrender. He whispered to no one, "That's the real thing." Thomas's hand slowed. The melody softened. The final notes approached, not like an ending but like a farewell spoken gently without urgency. He pressed the last key, held it, let the vibration fade, then lifted his hands slowly into the air. And stopped. Silence. Not the awkward kind. Not the uncomfortable kind. This silence was heavy. It stretched. 1 second. 2. 3. 5. No one clapped. No one moved. America was holding its breath. Then it happened. A single person in the audience stood. Then another's. Then another's. And suddenly the silence shattered, not into noise but into emotion. The applause erupted. Not polite. Not controlled. It was raw. People stood, clapping above their heads, shouting words Thomas could not hear but could see written across their faces. The applause did not fade. It grew. 30 seconds. A minute. 2 minutes. The longest standing ovation in the history of the show. Thomas opened his eyes. At first, he didn't understand. He saw movement everywhere, people standing, hands coming together, faces contorted with emotion. He looked around, overwhelmed, unsure. Dean Martin stepped forward and placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. Thomas turned. Their eyes met. Dean did not speak. He signed. Slowly. Clearly. You did it. Thomas's face crumpled. Tears fell not because he was sad, but because something he had never believed possible had just happened. He stood. The applause intensified. Dean pulled him into an embrace. 2 men at the center of the stage, one who could hear everything and one who never had, connected not by sound but by understanding. Dean finally reached for the microphone. His voice caught. He waited. Tried again. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, tonight we were taught something. He turned to Thomas. This man didn't hear your applause, Dean continued softly, but he felt your hearts. The audience rose again. Dean nodded once, as if sealing a promise. And I think, he said, we'll never forget that. Backstage, phones were already ringing. Producers stared at monitors in disbelief. NBC switchboards began to overload. Viewers were calling, not to complain, but to thank. In homes across the country, parents turned to their children and said, "Did you see that?" In hospitals, patients asked nurses to rewind the broadcast. In schools for the deaf, teachers gathered students around televisions, tears streaming down their faces. For the first time, millions of people were seeing silence not as absence, but as power. Thomas walked off stage in a daze. His family rushed to him, embracing him, laughing and crying at the same time. His mother signed through tears, "You changed everything." Thomas shook his head. He signed back, "No, he did." He looked back toward the stage, toward Dean Martin, toward the man who had refused to play it safe. That night, television did not just entertain. It transformed, and no one, not Dean, not Thomas, not America, would ever be the same again. The applause eventually ended, but the moment did not. It followed people home. It followed them into kitchens and bedrooms, into late-night phone calls and early morning conversations, into letters written by hand and tears wiped quietly from cheeks. By sunrise, America was still talking, not about a joke, not about a song, not about ratings. They were talking about silence. At NBC, the switchboards never stopped lighting up. Operators rotated shifts just to keep up. Calls came from parents of deaf children, from music teachers, from veterans who said the piano had reached places words never could. Letters arrived by the thousands, then tens of thousands. Some were neatly typed. Others were written in trembling handwriting. My son has never believed he belonged. Tonight he stood taller. Thank you for letting the world see him. Dean Martin read every letter he could. Alone, slowly, without jokes. For the first time in his career, he understood that entertainment had crossed into something far more dangerous and far more important. Meaning, Thomas Reed woke the next morning unsure if the night before had been real. His apartment was quiet, the familiar quiet, but his body felt different, as if the world had shifted its weight slightly in his favor. His sister burst into the room, holding newspapers, pointing wildly at headlines he could not hear but could see. The night television listened. Deaf pianist SDUNS Nation. Music without sound. Thomas pressed his hand to his chest. He had not chased fame. He had chased honesty. And honesty, it turned out, had a way of finding people. Dean called him that afternoon. Not as a host. Not as a celebrity. But as a man. Through careful signing and written notes, Dean said something Thomas would never forget. You didn't borrow our stage. You built your own. Then Dean did something unexpected. He stepped back. He refused interviews about himself. He redirected every question back to Thomas. When producers suggested follow-ups, specials, replays, Dean insisted on one rule. Let the music speak. And it did. The invitation arrived 2 weeks later. Carnegie Hall. Not a showcase. Not a novelty appearance. A full concert. Thomas sat with the letter in his hands, breathing slowly, feeling the weight of history pressing into the paper. His parents cried. His sister laughed through tears. He signed one sentence. Dean has to be there. On the night of the concert, the hall was full. Every seat. Every balcony. The audience stood before Thomas even played a note, not out of pity but out of respect. Dean Martin sat in the front row, quiet, still, hands folded, eyes fixed on the stage. Backstage, Thomas paused. He looked through the curtain and found Dean's eyes. Dean raised his hands. Signed 4 words. You already know. Thomas smiled. He sat, and when his fingers touched the keys, the hall seemed to inhale as one. This time the music soared. Not tentative. Not careful. It flew. By the final note, the applause thundered, not because of what Thomas lacked, but because of what he gave. He stood. He bowed. Then he placed one hand over his heart and extended it toward Dean. A sign. Thank you. Dean stood and returned it. A sign. Always. Years passed. Thomas traveled the world. He recorded albums. He played halls that once would have barred him without explanation. In every interview, he said the same thing, slowly, deliberately. Dean Martin did not help me because I was deaf. He helped me because I was honest. Dean never corrected him. He didn't need to. When Dean Martin passed away in 1995, Thomas attended the funeral quietly, without announcement. After the service, when words were exhausted, Thomas sat at a piano. He played the same piece, the one that had begun everything. No one spoke. No one moved. Because even in death, the lesson remained. Music is not sound. It is connection. Today at Carnegie Hall, a small plaque hangs near the stage. It does not mention ratings. It does not mention fame. It reads simply, music belongs to everyone. That sentence did not come from a producer. It came from a night when a man who could hear chose to listen, and a man who could not hear taught a nation how. Some moments entertain. Others change the rules. And on that night long ago, when silence walked onto a stage and courage refused to move aside, the world learned something it had forgotten. The greatest things are not always heard. They are felt.